The tires hummed a low, mournful song against the asphalt, a rhythm that had become the very heartbeat of the last 48 hours. Each mile marker that flashed past in the gloom was a small death, a tiny surrender of the man he used to be to the ghost he was becoming. Alexander Sterling had not slept. He had not eaten anything that wasn't processed sugar and caffeine from a gas station. He had not spoken a single word aloud since he'd left the sterile glass and steel cage of his penthouse in Manhattan, the city that had made him, and in its own quiet way, had also unmade him. The Bugatti Veyron, a chariot of gods and the ultimate status symbol for a man who had everything, felt like a gilded cage. Its leather interior, which usually smelled of success and expensive cologne, now reeked of stale coffee and the metallic tang of regret. The satellite navigation, a cool, unflappable female voice, had long since stopped offering encouraging words. It simply counted down the distance, a digital executioner marking the final moments of his old life. 2,400 miles, a distance that spanned ecosystems, climates, and, most significantly, years. Years of silence, years of carefully curated forgetfulness, years of building an empire on the ashes of a broken heart. He was 43, but his reflection in the rearview mirror told a story of a man 10 years older. His jaw, usually clean-shaven and sharp enough to cut glass, was shadowed with a salt and pepper stubble that gave him a feral, unkempt look. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were ringed with red veins like tiny cracks in fine porcelain. The power suits and the bespoke shoes were gone. He wore a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and a pair of worn-out driving shoes that had seen better days. He was stripped of the armor of his wealth, and it made him feel vulnerable, naked, and terrifyingly human for the first time in a decade. The town was called Haven's End, a misnomer if there ever was one. It wasn't an end, it was a beginning. It was a place so small and so far removed from the beating heart of commerce that it didn't even register on most maps. It was a postage stamp of a town nestled in the crook of a mountain range, where the air was thin and clean, and the loudest sound was the wind rustling through the ancient pines. It was the kind of place people went to hide, to heal, or to simply disappear. Amelia had chosen to disappear. He remembered the last time he saw her. It was in their Tribeca loft, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Hudson. She was standing by the window, her back to him, her silhouette framed against the pale, watery sunlight of a November morning. She was wearing one of his old sweaters, the gray cashmere one that was too big for her, and it made her look impossibly small and fragile. She hadn't turned around. She had just spoken, her voice a low, defeated murmur that he had to strain to hear over the sound of his own ego. "There's a difference between being busy and being absent," she had said. "And you, Alexander, you've been absent from my life for years. You're a ghost, a very wealthy, very successful ghost who shares my bed but not my heart." He had scoffed. He had been on the verge of finalizing a merger that would solidify his position in the global top 10. He didn't have time for emotional histrionics. "Amelia, you're being dramatic. This is what it takes. This is what it means to build a legacy." "I don't want a legacy," she'd whispered, finally turning to face him. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her eyes were not sad. They were empty. It was the most terrifying look he had ever seen, the look of someone who had finally stopped caring. "I wanted a life with you, but you've already chosen yours." She left the loft that day with nothing but a single suitcase and her art supplies. He let her go because he was too proud to beg, and because a small, arrogant part of him believed she would come back. She always came back, but she didn't. There were no phone calls, no emails, no desperate texts in the middle of the night. She had simply vanished, evaporating from his world like a morning mist. He threw himself into his work with a vengeance, burying himself under mountains of data, acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. He became the shark everyone feared, the man who ate competitors for breakfast. His name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and breathtaking wealth. He dated supermodels and actresses, women who were beautiful and vacant, perfect for the red carpets and charity galas. But in the quiet moments, in the lonely hours of the night when the city outside his window was a glittering, soulless void, he thought of her. He thought of the way she smelled of lavender and turpentine. He thought of the way she scrunched her nose when she laughed. He thought of the way she used to trace patterns on his chest with her finger as they fell asleep. Then a week ago a letter arrived. It was in her handwriting, the elegant, slightly slanted script that he would have recognized anywhere. His assistant, a young man named Julian with a face that was perpetually impassive, had placed it on his desk with the rest of the mail. He had almost thrown it away, thinking it was just another piece of junk. But his name, Alexander, was written across the front in that familiar ink, and his hand had trembled as he'd opened it. There was no greeting, no preamble, just a photograph and a single sentence written on the back of it. Her name is Lily. She has your eyes. The photograph was of a little girl. She was sitting on a wooden porch, surrounded by wildflowers, clutching a beat-up teddy bear in her arms. She had a spray of freckles across her nose and a brilliant, sunshine-bright smile. And her eyes were the exact shade of winter sky blue, the same as his, a startling, luminous blue that seemed to hold the entire sky within them. It was like looking into a mirror of his own soul. He saw his own stubborn chin, the same arch to his brows. It was undeniable, it was impossible, it was his child. A child he never knew existed. The world which he had so carefully constructed had shattered in an instant. The empire, the billions, the power, it all evaporated into meaninglessness. He was no longer Alexander Sterling, the titan of industry. He was simply a father who had missed the first 6 years of his daughter's life. And so the drive had begun. A frantic, desperate 2,400-mile pilgrimage of atonement. He didn't call. He didn't send a text. He didn't know what to say. What do you say to a woman you abandoned, a woman whose life you'd upended, when you show up on her doorstep years later with the evidence of her own secret? He just drove, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of hope, guilt, and a desperate, aching need to see that face again. Now he was here. The GPS announced his arrival with a curt, "You have reached your destination." He pulled the Bugatti to a stop on the gravel road, the sleek, aggressive lines of the car looking as out of place as a spaceship in a pastoral painting. The house was a modest 2-story cottage, painted a soft, fatting blue. There was a wraparound porch with a swing and a garden that was a riot of colors, purple lavender, yellow sunflowers, and red poppies. It was the picture of quaint, rustic tranquility. It was the life Amelia had always wanted. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. His palms were slick with sweat. He felt a tremor in his hands that he couldn't control. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his driving shoes. The air was crisp and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It was so quiet, so profoundly silent, that he could hear his own ragged breathing. He walked up the stone path, each step feeling like he was walking on broken glass. His mind was a chaotic storm of thoughts. What would she look like? Would she be happy? Would she be with someone else? He was irrationally jealous of a phantom, a man who might have given her the simple, stable life he never could. And the little girl, Lily, his daughter. He reached the front door, a simple wooden thing painted a cheery yellow. He raised his hand to knock, but it fell back to his side. He couldn't do it. A decade of being the most decisive man in the world, and he couldn't muster the courage to knock on a door. He stepped back, his gaze falling to the side of the house, where a small vegetable patch lay. That's when he saw her. She was playing in the dirt, a tiny, determined figure in a pink sundress. She had a little plastic trowel in her hand and was diligently digging a hole for a small tomato plant. Her brown hair was tied in 2 messy pigtails that stuck out from her head like antennae. He watched, mesmerized, as she patted the dirt around the plant with the seriousness of a master gardener. She was so focused, so completely lost in her own little world, that she didn't hear him approach. He was frozen, 30 feet away, unable to move, unable to speak. His throat was tight and his eyes were burning. He felt a sob building in his chest, a sound he hadn't made since he was a child. This was the moment. This was the face that had haunted him for a week. She finished her work, wiped her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her forehead, and stood up. She stretched, a tiny, majestic gesture of contentment. And then she turned. Her eyes met his. Time didn't just stop, it shattered. The world, the garden, the house, the mountains in the background, it all dissolved into a blur of color and light. The only thing in focus was that little girl, standing there with her trowel in her hand, looking up at him with his own eyes. Those brilliant blue eyes, the same as his, the same as his mother's, were filled with a curiosity that was unnerving and beautiful. He saw his own face, reflected in miniature. The same jawline, the same high cheekbones. It was like a time machine had taken him back to his own childhood, and his own 6-year-old self was staring back at him, pristine and unburdened. She tilted her head, a curious little bird assessing a new and strange object. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice a sweet, clear bell in the quiet of the afternoon. The sound of her voice was a physical blow. A wave of emotion, powerful and overwhelming, crashed over him. It was a mixture of love so profound it hurt, guilt so sharp it was a knife in his gut, and a bone-deep primal recognition. This was his blood. This was his legacy. Not the buildings, not the companies, not the billions. This tiny, perfect, dirt-smudged creature who looked at him with no pretense, no judgment. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a choked, broken sound came out. His eyes were brimming with tears, and he didn't try to hide them. He let them fall, tracing hot, messy paths down his stubbled cheeks. "No," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "No, I'm not lost." She took a step closer, her small brow furrowed in concentration. She looked him up and down, taking in his expensive but now rumpled car, his tired face, his wet cheeks. She didn't seem scared. She seemed curious. "Then why are you crying?" she asked, her question as simple and profound as a Zen koan. He knelt down, getting to her level. He was a giant before her, and he did his best to make himself seem smaller, less intimidating. His knees ached on the hard ground, but he didn't care. He was at the altar of his redemption. "Because," he said, his voice trembling, "I just realized I have a very important job to do." "What job?" she asked, her eyes widening. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the future. He saw all the birthdays he had missed, all the scraped knees he hadn't kissed, all the bedtime stories he hadn't read. He saw a lifetime of apologies and a lifetime of love ahead of him. His gaze was drawn to the small, plastic trowel in her hand. "It's a very important job," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "The most important job in the world." "And what is it?" She was hooked, her imagination ignited. He swallowed hard, the words feeling enormous in his mouth. "It's to be the best dad I can possibly be, to the most amazing little girl I've ever met." Door to the cottage creaked open. Amelia stepped out, a dish towel in her hand, her face a mask of complex emotions. Her eyes, the color of warm honey, locked onto him and widened in shock. She had aged, of course, but there was a strength in her face, a serenity that hadn't been there before. She looked from him to Lily and back again. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the towel. The air between them crackled with a decade of silent accusations, of abandoned love, of secrets too heavy to bear. For a moment, no one moved. The only sound was the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the oak tree in the yard. Lily looked from her mother to the strange, crying man. She was a perceptive child. She saw the look of alarm on her mother's face and her own small face clouded with concern. "Mama," she said, her voice quiet, "he's going to be my best dad." The statement, so innocent and absolute, was a benediction. It was a declaration from the universe that Alexander's journey, his 2,400 miles of doubt and fear, had not been in vain. Amelia's face crumpled. The dish towel fell from her nerveless fingers. The struggle was over. She had tried to protect her daughter from the man who had broken her, to build a fortress around their tiny world. But the fortress had a chink in the form of those eyes, the same eyes that were now looking up at him with unwavering trust. There was a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her lower lip. She had spent years telling herself that Alexander didn't deserve to know, that his life was too full, too loud, too complicated for a child. She had convinced herself she was doing the right thing. But seeing him now, broken and weeping on his knees before their daughter, all those carefully constructed walls came crashing down. "Alexander," she said, her voice a broken whisper. She didn't know what else to say. There were too many words, too many emotions. A decade of pain and silence coalesced into the simple utterance of his name. He looked up at her, his eyes still wet, his face streaked with tears and grime from the road. "Amelia," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't make excuses for his past. He didn't mention the business, the success, the billions. He knew, with a certainty that had been absent for so long, that none of that mattered. None of it could bridge the chasm he had dug with his own arrogance and neglect. "Mother," Lily said, her small voice cutting through the thick silence. "Why is he crying? Did you make him sad?" Amelia's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter. She was the best thing she had ever done, the light in the darkness of her exile. She knelt down next to Alexander and her daughter, her dress brushing against the dirt. She placed a hand on Lily's small shoulder and looked into her eyes, those brilliant blue eyes that were a constant, daily reminder of the man she had left behind. "No, sweetheart," Amelia said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't make him sad. He's sad because he's been looking for us for a very long time, and he's finally found us." Lily considered this for a moment. She was at that magical age where the world was still full of possibility and miracles. "Was he lost?" she asked, echoing her earlier question. Alexander shook his head, a sad, rueful smile touching his lips. "More than you could ever imagine, Lily, more than you could ever imagine." Later, much later, when the sun had dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, they were sitting on the porch swing. Lily, a whirlwind of energy finally exhausted, had fallen asleep on Alexander's chest. His arms were wrapped protectively around her, cradling her like a precious jewel, and a sensation of profound, terrifying love washed over him. He could feel the steady, rhythmic thump of her tiny heart, a fragile drumbeat against his own. Amelia sat on the other end of the swing, a glass of iced tea in her hand, her foot gently pushing to create a lazy, rocking rhythm. She watched him, her gaze filled with a complex tapestry of feelings he was only beginning to understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child in his arms. His voice was raw, scraped clean of all pretense. "All these years, why didn't you let me be part of her life?" Amelia let out a long, shaky breath. "I thought I was protecting her," she said, her voice barely audible. "And I was protecting myself. You were so consumed by your work, by your ambition. I was just a footnote in your life, a distraction. How could I bring a child into that? I thought it would be easier to just disappear, to let you have your empire and let me have my daughter." She paused, swallowing hard. "I was angry. I was so angry, Alexander. I hated you for choosing money over me, for making me feel like I wasn't enough." "I don't have an excuse, Amelia," he said, turning to look at her. His eyes were earnest, the eyes of a man who had seen the abyss and had been pulled back from the edge. "I was an idiot, a selfish, stupid, blinded by ambition idiot. I thought I was building something for us for the future, but I didn't realize I was just building a prison for myself. I was a ghost, just like you said." She felt a tear escape, tracing a path down her cheek. "She has your eyes," she whispered. "Every single day I see you in her. The way she furrows her brow when she's concentrating, the way she laughs, the way she stubbornly refuses to give up on something she wants. It was torture, but it was also the best part of my life." "I know," he said, his voice breaking. "I saw it. In that photograph I saw a reflection of myself. It was like looking into a mirror and seeing who I was supposed to be. A father. I've been a CEO, a tycoon, a man who people fear, but I've never been a father. And I don't know how to be one, but I want to learn. I want to be part of her life, Amelia. I want to earn her trust. I want to earn yours." The request hung in the air between them. as heavy and as fragile as a soap bubble. It was a plea for redemption, a desperate attempt to stitch back together a decade of torn fabric. "You can't just drive up here in your fancy car and expect everything to be forgiven," she said, but there was no heat in her voice. It was a statement of fact, a boundary being gently drawn. "You missed her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. You weren't there when she was sick or when she had nightmares. You can't buy that back, Alexander. Money can't build a time machine." "I know," he said again, his gaze dropping to the sleeping child. "I know I can't undo the past. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I've changed, that I understand what's truly important." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. It was the first time he had touched her in 10 years, and the contact sent a jolt of electricity through him. It was like coming home. "I don't want the empire anymore, Amelia," he said, the admission coming out as a soft, weary sigh. "I realized that on the drive here. It's all just noise. It's a hollow thing, all of it. It doesn't matter if I'm the richest man in the world if I'm empty inside." She looked at their joined hands, then back up at his face. She saw the exhaustion, the remorse, the desperate hope in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had been humbled by life, who had been stripped bare of his armor. It was the Alexander she had fallen in love with, the one she had buried deep inside her heart. "I was building a life here," she said softly. "It's small and it's simple and it's ours. I'm not sure I'm ready to let you tear it all apart again." "No," he said quickly. "No, I'm not going to tear it apart. I want to build it up with you, with her. I don't care if we live in a shack in the middle of the woods. I just want to be here. I'll commute, I'll sell the company, I'll do whatever it takes." The little girl stirred, shifting in his arms, and let out a small, contented sigh. He looked down at her, and he felt his heart swell to a size that could barely be contained by his chest. This was it. This was the feeling he had been chasing his entire life, the one that had always seemed so elusive, so just out of reach. It wasn't about winning. It wasn't about power. It was about belonging. "She's not going to understand right away," Amelia said, a cautious optimism creeping into her voice. "She's a smart girl, but she's still a child. She'll have questions, and I don't know how to explain to her why you haven't been here." "Then we'll tell her the truth," he said firmly. "We'll tell her I was lost and that I found my way back." The following days were a strange, surreal blend of awkwardness and discovery. Alexander Sterling, a man who could command boardrooms and sway global markets, was learning how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that wasn't a total disaster. He was learning how to braid hair, his large, clumsy fingers producing lopsided pigtails that made Lily giggle. He was learning how to play tea party with a collection of worn-out dolls and a plastic teapot that was missing its lid. He was a student of domesticity, and he was failing spectacularly. But Lily didn't care. She was simply ecstatic to have a new playmate, a new, fascinating, and deeply strange person in her life. She didn't understand the complex history between her mother and this man. All she knew was that he made her mother smile, and he had the same eyes as she did. One afternoon, they were all in the garden, planting new vegetables for the summer. Amelia was on her knees, patting soil around a row of carrots. Alexander was attempting to hoe a straight line, a task that was proving to be monumentally difficult. Lily was beside him, helping by dropping seeds into the ground with the chaotic, enthusiastic randomness of a toddler. "Like this," she said, demonstrating how to properly drop a seed. "You have to be gentle." He watched her, a broad smile on his face, the first real smile he had felt in a decade. "Like this?" he asked, mimicking her movement. "No, no, no," she said, shaking her head with the authority of a tiny drill sergeant. "That was too heavy. You have to be gentle. The seed is sleeping and you can't wake it up too hard." He knelt down, his knees protesting, and looked her in the eye. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice earnest. "I'm still learning. I've been doing a lot of things too heavy my whole life. I have to learn to be gentle." She looked at him, her brilliant blue eyes examining his face with an intensity that was startling. "It's okay," she said, patting his arm. "We're going to be a family, right? Families are about learning." The question was simple, but it pierced him to his core. He looked up at Amelia, who had stopped her work and was watching them, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The question hung in the air, a promise and a test. He had the chance to shape the narrative, to define this fragile new reality. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "Yes, Lily, we're a family, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life learning how to be a good one." He still had the Bugatti, a gleaming, useless testament to his past life. He left it parked under a tarp in a neighbor's barn, a concession to his new reality. He didn't need it. He didn't need the billions, the companies, the power. He had a daughter who had his eyes and a heart that was slowly, cautiously opening up to him. He had a woman who was beginning to trust him again, and a small, blue house that smelled of lavender and fresh bread. It was a small life, a quiet life. But for the first time in his life, Alexander Sterling knew what it felt like to be truly rich.